today I'm focusing particularly on what was Cardijn's involvement and attitude to cooperatives and the cooperative movement. And actually it's quite interesting, really. I'd never thought of specifically about his involvement with cooperatives before, even though of course I knew that there were many YCW initiatives in different countries of the world which had ended up in cooperatives. So it's quite interesting to see how actually that fits into his overall kind of thoughts and strategies. And in fact, if you look at his thought, which at the end of his life he did prepare a number of documents summarising his thinking and things. You can really summarise his social action in terms of two pillars of action. He set this out in a document in 1900 relating to his reading when he was a young man from 1907 to 1912, and he put two key words there: trade unions and cooperatives. Only 2 words. He didn't say more than that, so it's kind of been up to me to sort of go back and see what does those words cooperative mean, what do they mean to him. And then there's 3 words there which actually we'll see how that's what they actually did mean to him in his work. Education. Cooperatives lead to worker education, as do trade unions. They lead to responsibility on the part of workers, and that's also eventually a way of building democracy. Here in our English tradition, I don't know how many of you might have heard of this guy called Philip Boucher, who was he described himself as a Christian socialist. He was a Catholic actually. He called himself a Christian socialist back in the 1820s, and already started organising worker cooperatives from the 1830s in Paris. And he was very much involved in the French revolutions of 1848, when actually, in fact, many people have said that was actually an attempt at a cooperative revolution. Another fellow there called, from that period also, Louis Blanc, called for the creation in 1848 of worker cooperatives to create employment for the poor. Unfortunately, that all failed, really, partly because it was a top-down initiative. They thought, well, let's all create cooperatives for the workers, and the workers will have work and everything will happen. What actually happened was, I can't tell you the history of 1848, but it was kind of, to put it in a few words, it ended in disaster. And it was really a tragedy, really. This guy, Bernard Moss, who's writing in the Encyclopedia of 1848 Revolutions, he makes an interesting comment, actually, that the spectre haunting France and Europe in 1848 was not communism and certainly not Marxism, but rather cooperative and republican socialism. So actually, it's a very interesting kind of way to think about the revolutions of 1848. There really was an attempt, as I say, unsuccessful, but to build an alternative society based on cooperatives. Ended in failure, and it led to a new generation of work in France under the name of the School of Nimes, the city in the south of France. This actually was a Protestant initiative, or at least the people who started were Protestants, French Protestants. The famous figure there was a guy called Charles Gide, who was an economist, also a Christian socialist, presented himself as a Christian socialist, and for him the alternative was between state socialism, which was coercive, as the word he actually used, and voluntary socialism based on cooperatives, which is facultative. So that was kind of the concept he presented, which the Sion worked upon. In fact, it's interesting, their Congress, they give a very complete figure or study across Europe of all the different cooperative initiatives that were going on there in 1907. Really, a lot of things were happening at that time, and it's amazing to think, we're kind of in a way restarting the cooperative movement today, but we're kind of picking up from things that were happening 100 years ago. And of course, even in France, everybody recognised, even though there were early cooperatives there, England was really the source where, of course, through the famous cooperatives of Rochdale and all that, where they defined the cooperative principles. So also in France, they were studying those principles as well, and it's clear that Cardijn was studying those as well. The Sion movement, from which he took so many of his initiatives, also started a number of cooperatives, including daily newspaper, eventually a daily newspaper, and also smaller things like cooperative bakeries and things like that. It's interesting to see how even today people are starting again with similar sorts of things. The second key experience for him, for Cardijn, was when he went to, what flows on from this vision of England as the place from where the cooperative movement came. He made a special trip to England in 1911 to study the trade union movement and also the cooperative movement. It's also interesting to see the people he contacted over in the UK. All of them to a person. These days you can find out who these people were through Googling them. To a person, everyone I've Googled so far, they were all identified themselves as Christian socialists. So you can see this is clearly the sort of tradition with which Cardijn identified, and who were doing the things that he was kind of trying to do himself. He visited things like the cooperative depots and sort of wholesale cooperatives up in Manchester. He also visited this famous trade unionist of the time called Ben Tillett, who was really the key person who probably was his main influence at that time. Tillett had just been organising the workers on the docks and founded what became a National Transport Workers Union. He worked very closely with the other famous trade unionist, Tom Mann, who actually, I believe I was looking up Tom Mann. He actually spoke in this building here about 100 years ago. The famous British trade unionist came to Australia for a few years and worked here. But it's interesting to see how these trade union leaders actually also had a strong cooperative vision as well. And Cardijn's quotes on Tillet's are run through with the words of cooperation, not just cooperation to create economic cooperatives, but also cooperation, not just craft trade unions, but cooperating on a larger scale for enterprise level trade unions and different things like that. Tom Mann and Tillett, they saw that competition would give way to cooperation. Well, that was their objective. In fact, they even had a phrase which they developed of a cooperative commonwealth. One of the interesting things is I've read both of their biographies. Neither Tillett nor Tom Mann mentioned cooperatives, this concept of the cooperative commonwealth, in their biographies. But so somehow in the space of the 1890s, when they developed this concept, up to the time they wrote in their old age, they wrote their biographies in the 1930s, somehow this cooperative kind of idea had drifted away from the cooperative movement. But you see there originally there was a very strong parallel and working together of the trade unions and the cooperatives, and you can see very much that they were the ideas that Cardijn took with him into his own work in the parish. Finally going to the parish in 1912, as I said, 100 years ago, organising young women workers working in clothing factories. And immediately, apart from organising trade unions, first things he starts is things like savings cooperatives and things like that. The sad thing is when he actually got to be in charge of a number of cooperatives that were already existing in Brussels, it's a kind of a disastrous experience that he found. Conflict, corruption, quality, litigation. His whole life from 1915 to 1920 was actually trying to uproot the corruption that were in these early cooperatives that were there in Brussels. It was a total disastrous experience, but fortunately, or somehow, it didn't actually deter him from the cooperative vision that he already had. And from the 1920s, you can see actually he worked with people to start developing a number of cooperatives. Again, bakeries is a very popular one. Savings, again. This one, they started off with a series of credit cooperatives, eventually became a bank, a sort of cooperative bank. The sad thing is, as has happened in many countries, the demutualisation in the 80s, taken over by this big bank now called Dexia. But it's interesting to see how all these things grew out of savings cooperatives back in the early part of the 1920s. A whole range of cooperatives. You look at the things what this Central Economic Cooperative were doing. It was a wholesale consumer cooperative trying to provide fair-priced goods for working people. So there's a whole vision of cooperatives as sort of the second pillar of working with the trade unions. So again, this is an attitude that he gathered through his whole life. In fact, he actually brought it into Catholic teaching as well in quite a significant way. In 1961, for those of you who are Catholics, Pope John the 23rd published a well-known encyclical called Mater and Magistra. In fact, that encyclical was proposed by Cardijn, who wrote actually 20 pages of drafting notes for Pope John. And it's interesting to see that encyclical is the only encyclical which speaks extensively of cooperatives as a base for an alternative economy. So we see how all through his life he's working on the cooperatives, cooperation as an organising principle, the two pillars of cooperatives and unions, democracy based on education for worker responsibility. And this is the question I'll leave with you. Is that the basis today for working again for a new kind of cooperative commonwealth? Thank you.